Good afternoon. I'm Subhi Ali, Chairman of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center, and I would like to welcome everybody here today. I can tell you how grateful we are that you have joined us in this commemoration and tribute to the legacy of Dr. Naseer Aruri.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lena Saikali, and I'm delighted to be part of this commemoration for Dr. Aruri. I'm going to be performing an original composition I wrote based on an excerpt from the poem Enemy of the Sun, which was translated by Dr. Aruri and Dr. Gharib. So hope you enjoy. I may, if you wish, lose my livelihood. Ooh. I may sell my shirt. I may sell my bed. Ooh. I may work cutting stones or clean your streets and stores. Ooh. And rummage there for food. I may lay down hungry, O enemy of the sun, but I shall not compromise for this. Ooh. And to the last pulse in my veins, I shall resist. I may lay down hungry, O enemy of the sun, but I shall not compromise for this. Ooh.
pulse in my veins. I shall resist. O enemy of the sun.
Thank you very much. Dave Mosek on guitar.
Thank you, Lena and David. That was Lena Saikali as the vocalist and David Mosek on the guitar. Thank you again. And thank you again for being here. The Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center welcomes all of you here. And on behalf of our board of directors and the family of Dr. Aruri, I would like to welcome you again and thank you for being here. Dr. Aruri was one of our pillars at the Jerusalem Fund. I met Dr. Aruri for the very first time when Dr. Sharabi called for few Palestinians from around the world to meet here to discuss activism about Palestine. And I thought I was going to be the very first person here in this institution. When I came in, there was Naseer ahead of me. And I introduced myself, and he immediately autographed and gave me one of his books. And we started a friendship that lasted for over 20 years plus. Naseer was, as I will refer to him, was a principal and one of the strongest members of the executive committee of CPAP. For some of you who would remember that, that was the Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine, which was the name that the Palestine Center was known with for over 10 years before it was changed to the Palestine Center. Then he joined the board of directors of the Jerusalem Fund for many years. Dr. Aruri and Naseer was a silent contributor. He was a man who did things quietly, silently, and believed that it's amazing how much we can achieve if we don't care who gets the credit. Naseer had integrity. And I'm always reminded of the definition of integrity, and I'm sure there are many. Integrity is defined as what a person does when no one is watching. You didn't see Naseer's name first in the list of contributors to something about Palestine, but many times he was there. He was a man of many accomplishments, very well published about Palestine and other things, but he was one of the most active and influential Palestinian activists over the last 30 years. Again, quietly. You will hear a lot today about Naseer from Naseer's friends, and I will let him talk about him before we hear concluding remarks by members of his family. But first, we will witness a tribute to Dr. Naseer Aruri. Thank you. That was very moving and befitting of the memory of Naseer. On a personal note, when I met Naseer here at that time, I told him where I was from another small town that's still standing in Palestine, Deir Dibwan. He said, yeah, he knows Deir Dibwan. He lived there, actually. His father was principal of the school in Deir Dibwan for several years, and the Aruri family actually lived there. So we shared that. Now we will hear from one of Naseer's offsprings, Jamil Aruri. I'm looking for Jamil. Oh, okay. I was afraid for a minute that you have stepped down. Jamil is an attorney at law in Lowell, Massachusetts, where he has a private practice in family law. He is a member of the bar of the Massachusetts Bar Association since 1993. Jamil?
It's nice to be here. Thank you for those kind words, Dr. Ali, and thank you so much to you and the board of the Jerusalem Fund for conceiving of this event and for organizing this event. And Zaina, thank you so much for all the work and effort that you put in towards this. I understand you just began your tenure here, and I'm sure it's going to continue to go wonderfully. Lena and David, that was really beautiful. My father always liked soothing music, and he certainly would have loved that. And the fact that it came from a book that he and Edmund Gharib co-edited would have been really even more, even more heartfelt for him to hear that. Oh, I'm sorry. And Samira, thank you so much. My brother Jay is the producer of that video. It's actually a shortened version of one that we had played at the memorial service for my father that his university had. And Samira was nice enough to go through the Jerusalem Fund archives to, can't hear me? Okay, that's not usually an issue for me, but to go, does this go up? And to, there we go. And to find some pictures of my father, at the Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine, and with people that are in this room. I'm sure Phyllis appreciated some of the pictures of her that were in there that were dug out. At any rate, my father really enjoyed his time here at the Jerusalem Fund and the Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine. He would always like to come here because he had so many old friends that are here, some of whom are here today. And it also allowed him to stay in the home of his dearest friend, someone who was really like a brother to him, and that's Samih Farsoon. So it was a special place for him, and this was a special place to come. Life's journey was anything but predictable for my father. At the age of 20, his father gave him a plane ticket to America first semester's tuition, and 2 pieces of advice. Study something practical, meaning engineering, and stay away from women. Needless to say, he succeeded on neither front. His plan, so to speak, was to attend American International College in Springfield, AIC, where his older brother, Saeed, was already a student. He knew little about America and even less about the college that he'd be attending. And like many immigrants, my father struggled with the concept of identity. As a young boy in Palestine, his family had residences both in the city and the village. In his birthplace of Jerusalem, where he lived and went to school, the city kids would refer to him as falah, which is the Arabic term for from the country or the rural areas. While when he would go home to the village of Burham, the village kids would call him Medini, which is a city person. And they would say that very pejoratively, actually. At AIC, he was simply known as Saeed's brother. And he had a difficult time there. Despite the name of the college, it had very few international students and not a single political science course. He felt very isolated, and he spent most of his time studying and working second shift at a local textile factory, where he was paid 97 cents an hour, money that he had used to pay for his tuition and his living expenses. It wasn't until he later met and fell in love with a young woman of Lebanese ancestry from Springfield, Joyce Thomas, that things began to change for the better. And although he was a Muslim from Palestine and she a Maronite Catholic from Springfield, the love that they had for each other transcended religious affiliations and overcame what was considered at that time to be taboo, let's say. My father pursued his doctorate at UMass Amherst, and his commencement, according to his account, was held on a bright, sunny Amherst day on June 4th, 1967. His father, as Dr. Ali referred to, he was the headmaster of an elementary school in Beit Hanina. Is that correct? And his father had crossed the Atlantic for the first time to be with him at his commencement and to also meet his 2 grandchildren that were born shortly there before for the first time. Yet his joy surrounding these events was very short-lived, as some of you probably could guess. This is his account of what had transpired. And I'll quote, "Everyone was exuberant, yet none of us had known what was in store for us the next day as we celebrated. None of us had anticipated that in but a few hours, a war would transform the political and geographic landscape of the Middle East for decades to come. Breaking the dreadful news to my father the next morning was an awesome responsibility," he said. "The look on his face when I made the somber announcement expressed his reaction." He then quoted his father as saying, "I lived under Turkish rule, British and Jordanian control, and now, if I ever make it back, I will most likely spend the rest of my life under Israeli occupation." My father remarked of his father's reaction, "It almost had a ring of resignation, but in reality, it conveyed a great deal of determination and exacerbation," noting that his father added that newer generations will undoubtedly emerge and terminate this occupation as they dismantle the previous ones. And it was really this calling that would dominate the actions of my father for the majority of his life. I was probably 5 or 6 years old when it became quite apparent to me that my father's life and activities were radically different than those of my friends' parents. People who called on the phone, for the most part, were not named John or Bill or Steve or Susan. They were Mujid and Samih, Abdeen, Fuad, and Elaine. We did have Elaine. They weren't calling about getting together or seeing my parents at the next social event or town event. They were long calls that seemingly went on forever, many involving my father hurriedly writing things on a pad of paper while cradling the phone between his neck and shoulder, and almost always in a mix of Arabic and English. Our basement, in addition to housing bicycles and toys, was filled with boxes and file cabinets and bookshelves, and a large desk with drawers filled with paper and envelopes with the very familiar AAUG logo. My siblings and I knew that at 6:30 in the evening, the television was off limits to us. The nightly news would be put on. It was rarely a passive event. We'd grown accustomed to my father, as well as my mother, debating the man on the television set every time Israel, Palestine, or the Arabs were being discussed. My parents had told us that our country, Palestine, had been stolen by the Zionists, and that the Palestinians lost everything, their land, their homes, all of their personal possessions. That many of them had been killed by the Zionists. We knew that we had a cousin in Palestine who was a professor who was in jail, imprisoned by the Israelis, without ever being accused of anything. Naturally, we could not come to grips with the unfairness of such a situation. Surely the police would arrest these Zionists, and they would be ordered to give the Palestinians back their homes. It wasn't until later we learned that this would not happen because the police was in fact America, the country where we were born and whose flag we saluted every morning before the start of each school day. It was made clear to us that the Jews were not our enemies. The Zionists did this to us, and while many of them were Jews, there were many Jews who were trying to help us. We tried to make sense of it all, but very little of it made any sense. It was a simple case of right and wrong, but no one seemed to know that except us. Everywhere we looked in America, we were told that we were the bad guys. We were the terrorists, the Israelis were the victims. On television, we wore strange checkered headdresses. They dressed in suits. We spoke in broken English with accents. They spoke in perfect English that was easy to understand. We would yell and argue with the man on the television who demanded answers to his questions. They would agree with the same man asking the same questions. It was during this period that my father and other Arab intellectuals living in America knew that they needed to mobilize. There was an urgent need to provide Americans with accurate and scholarly information on the Arab world in general and Palestine in particular. This is precisely why the AAUG was formed. Along with his family and teaching duties, this organization, the AAUG, seemed to consume every spare minute of my father's time. My father would be writing, traveling, speaking, and organizing meetings, many of which took place in our home. And a large part of me wanted this all to disappear, not only so the Palestinians could be normal, but so things in our house could be normal. As I perceived that term at that time. I remember vividly my parents once putting my brother Jay and I in a car and taking us to a demonstration at a local Denny's restaurant. The restaurant had changed its name to Sambo's. There was a small group of us, many of whom were African Americans, who were marching and speaking out against the racist name that Denny's had chosen. I was probably no older than 7 or 8, and I remember feeling very out of place. We had grown up in a white, upper middle class town where going to Little League games was far more popular than speaking out against racism. There were virtually no minorities in our school and certainly no Arabs. There were times growing up that I much preferred my father being better versed in football than in struggles against colonialism. Yet despite all this, my parents were always able to maintain a balance between parental duties and Palestine duties. They loved us immensely and unconditionally and made certain that the lives of their 4 children didn't get lost in all of the chaos that was surrounding us. They were cognizant that the identity crisis my father experienced growing up in Palestine, which had increased exponentially when he came to America, was also being experienced by their children. This led to many encounters that, although were uncomfortable at the time, they're things that our family shared many laughs about later in life. Growing up in our house during that time, the traditional sexist roles assigned to husband and wife were in fact reversed. People probably know that my father couldn't distinguish a touchdown from a home run, let alone understand the complexities of American sports. So it was my mother who would take us to all our football, basketball, and baseball games, while my father would stay home cooking dinner. Once in a while, my father would appear at one of our games, not really understanding what was going on, and depending on the excesses of U.S. foreign policy that day, it was 50-50 whether he'd rise for the national anthem. Social justice, compassion, and egalitarianism were not only values that my parents stressed while we were growing up, they were values that were put into practice. My father's lectures in the house were no less comprehensive than those in the classroom. We knew never to say that we were starving, because there were children that actually were, and not to complain about what we didn't have, because most of the world had far less. And while as a kid, the lectures would seem worn out and tiresome, today, my siblings and I are truly grateful that our parents stressed idealism over assimilation, compassion over self-interest, and resistance over compliance. There were many obstacles facing the Palestinian people, and there was a pervasive theme that would appear in my father's writings and at his speaking engagements, what he called transforming constraints into opportunities. And although my father was both a scholar and an activist, activism always took precedence. He spent the majority of his life working and fighting so that the Palestinian people could attain a normal existence. And in a field where there's been countless sellouts, inflated egos, and opportunities for personal gain, my father always remained focused on advancing the cause of his people, as well as other dispossessed peoples around the world. He was as principled as they come, never dogmatic and not a speechmaker. His approach was always rational and grounded, never engaging in rhetoric or bravado. He never allowed a feeling of self-importance to get in the way of working with others to advance the cause. And whether that meant appearing on national television or mentoring a young student who expressed an interest in Palestine, my father's commitment remained the same. My mother was not only his lifelong companion, but also his confidant and his most trusted advisor. If there was any hesitation on what type of stance to take on an issue, her advice was always to state things the way they were, no sugarcoating, no apologies. She pushed him toward all his goals, and he looked up to her more than any dignitary, intellectual giant, or world leader he ever crossed paths with. My father would have been so appreciative of the efforts of the Jerusalem Fund to honor his life this afternoon, but he wouldn't want it to be just about him. He would want this to be about all of you and the countless others who refuse to let the Palestinians continue to be the casualties of geopolitical realities. I say this because I witnessed the efforts of a single individual in this struggle and all of the sacrifice, perseverance, and pain that accompanied it. Yet, we were never shot at, our house was never bombed or bulldozed into a pile of rubble, our electricity never shut off, our water never denied. We had no curfews, our schools were never closed. We weren't subjected to the humiliation of checkpoints and never had to worry when a family member would leave the house if that would be the last time we saw each other. Yet, we felt the anguish and despair of our people as if it was actually happening to us. We were overjoyed with the hope that accompanied the First Intifada and crushed when it never translated into independence. We watched approvingly on television as Palestinians articulated our cause with eloquence, rationality, and conviction, while Israeli apologists repeated the same worn-out and discredited cliches. We stood proud as our new leaders refused to budge in Madrid, only to find out that our old leaders had capitulated in Oslo. And we lived through all of this in a country that was actively hostile to our cause, which at the official level was slandering the Palestinians and distorting their history. country that provided Israel with the financial, economic, and diplomatic resources that allowed it to continue to subjugate the Palestinians. But the one constant throughout all of this has been resistance, collective resistance from so many different people in so many different places who refuse to allow us to continue despite enormous obstacles. So in this spirit, let this not just be a remembrance of Naseer Aruri. Let this also be a commemoration for the Palestinians of Deir Yassin, Lud, and Ramli. For all the Palestinians of 1948 who lost their lives defending their land, their families, and their neighbors. For Sabra and Shatila, and all those who passed away in the refugee camps hoping until their last breath that they would someday return to Palestine. For the people of Hebron, surrounded by fanatical racist settlers who invoke God and Uzis in the place of legality and morality. For the Palestinian children who face tanks with stones, their lives at the mercy of a merciless army. To our poets, our writers, our intellectuals, and our thinkers in Palestine and the diaspora, who fought with the pen as mightily as those who resisted with the sword. To our leaders gunned down all over the world in cold blood because they put the dream of Palestine ahead of their own safety and security. Let us commemorate those who remained transformed from the majority to a minority in the blink of an eye, living in Palestinian ghettos, trapped between a racist state that does not want them and a Palestinian authority that doesn't represent them. To all the Rachel Coreys and Tom Herndals who were called to this cause not out of ethnic obligation, but out of civic duty, not due to self-interest, but an interest in others, who believe that this was not only the Palestinian cause, but also the world's cause. And let this be a commemoration for the countless number of Jews all over the world who refuse to equate Judaism with Zionism, who would rather be labeled self-hating than to hate, and who prefer to be ostracized in their own communities than occupiers in someone else's. For the Palestinians and Israelis who realize that ethnic claims, religious invocations, and national fervor must be replaced with equality, secularism, and human rights, and that no one is free unless everyone is free, and who are working toward a truly democratic state where rights aren't denied under the rules of military decree, but granted under the rule of law. Every word my father wrote, every sentence he uttered, every last bit of energy he could muster was for the purpose of seeing his people live in freedom. And Dad, while you never lived to see your vision materialize, surely the constraints will one day be transformed into opportunities. And while this day will have come without you bearing witness, it will most certainly mark the harvest of the seedlings that you and countless others have planted and fought to keep growing during the best days of your lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamil. The program mentions that next will be Dr. Edmund Gharib, who had to go for an interview but will be back. So I am put in among the second group of Naseer's friends and colleagues. But few comments. You saw CBAP mentioned, Center of Policy Analysis on Palestine. I always had to try to remember what that was. Being a surgeon and not an academic, Naseer was one of the people who was enthusiastic about renaming CPAP the Palestine Center. I'm another fallah from Ramallah, and the town that your dad was a principal of was Deir Dibwan. He may have been at Beit Hanina, but they speak very fondly of him, of the Aruri, who was principal of he left a good legacy. You mentioned also and others, some of Naseer's friends and a lot of us remember about him that he did not bend to what was politically correct in the United States on the Palestinian scene. Regardless of what happened at Madrid, Oslo, and others, Naseer never changed. He did not bend to what was sexy at the time. That's why a group of us formed TARI, Trans-Arab Research Institute, right after Oslo, and that was active at the time. Some of those long calls that you witnessed were myself and Naseer talking. Whenever I called Joyce to ask for Naseer, I think she knew that there was going to be a long conversation. Three of Naseer's friends are going to say some words about him. The very first on the schedule, you can see Dr. Yusuf Farsakh, who will follow you. Dr. Farsakh is a retired professor of mathematics who taught at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, University of Connecticut, and the American University of Beirut, among other places, as well as Saudi Arabia. Special note about Dr. Farsakh is that at the University of Massachusetts, he was Naseer's roommate. Subsequently, he would know Naseer way before you and I did. Dr. Farsakh.
Thank you. Actually, I knew Naseer for a long time. The first time I saw him was, I first met young Naseer in the fall of 1945. I was appointed to teach in an elementary school in Beit Hanina, a village a few miles northwest of Jerusalem, where his father was the principal and he was a student. He was 11 years old at the time. I taught him arithmetic. The Aruris are from Burham, which is close to my hometown of Birzeit, and our families knew each other. The one and only one Jewish settlement that existed between Ramallah and Jerusalem at that time was built on Beit Hanina's land. It's called Neve Yaqub, I think, of some sort. My next encounter with Naseer and his older brother Saeed came 8 years, excuse me, I need my glasses to read my own words. Came 8 years later when I was accepted at American International College, a small college actually, which has many veterans at the time, because there was that veteran education, free education, and also there was a large number of foreign students. And of course, Naseer and others did not see much of the school because if people had to work their way through school, then you see very little of it. Saeed had introduced a popular weekly Arabic program in Springfield that mentioned the news of the Arab American community and also have Arabic songs. This actually brought Arab Americans and Arabs students close together. One day, Naseer and I were on the bus when we saw Joyce Thomas. Where is Joyce Thomas now? Joyce? Now I can see her. And some of her classmates from her college. And I had the pleasure of introducing her to Naseer because I knew her father before her. Later, I was at the University of Massachusetts mathematics PhD program when I met my future wife, Andrea, who was a student at Mount Holyoke. When Naseer joined the University Political Science PhD program, we lived together for a while, and I explained to him differential equations because they were requiring some differential equations in some political course of some sort. Naseer was a good cook. He did the cooking, and I washed the dishes. He made excellent maqloobin. Naseer, we made a good bachelor duo. Although Naseer had some trouble following straightforward equations, he was a master at freestyle creative cooking. While my methodical mathematical mind served me well as a dishwasher. After living with Naseer for 2 years, he was my best man when Andrea and I married. In the fall of 1960, when I was at the university, American University of Beirut, Naseer was on his way from America to Palestine and stopped to see me. He has some books with him. One of them had a hammer and sickle on the cover. The Jordanian border officer, without Naseer's knowledge, gave a letter to his taxi driver to hand over to the first police station in Amman regarding the suspicious book cover. Naseer, the suspected communist, spent the night in the police station. Thanks to an influential uncle, he was let out the following day. I miss Naseer's constant diligence and devotion to Palestine. And hope that Naseer Aruri's life and work will serve as an inspiration to our younger generations.
Thank you, Dr. Farsak. Our next speaker is a friend of Naseer, friend of the Palestine Center, and a friend of Palestine. Phyllis Bennis directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She's been a writer, analyst, and activist on the Middle East and UN issues for many years. She has been a guest to speak at the Palestine Center many times, including the last time Naseer was here, I believe, in 2009. Phyllis?
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Thank you all for being here. What a gift that we had Naseer with us all these years. What a gift it has been. You know, a couple of weeks ago, there was a conference here in Washington of people who had been active in the Vietnam anti-war movement. And these were mainly people who are now in their 70s, honoring the elders who had to be over 80 because the people organizing it were 75 or so. And it was kind of a great thing. It was a great reunion, a great chance to see people 40 years, 50 years later. But there was something missing. Young people. There was no clear movement that could say the Vietnam movement today is made up of 20 and 30-year-olds who are doing X. And it was talked about. It was a real problem. We don't have that problem in the Palestine movement. And it's partly because of Naseer that we don't have that problem. We have young people who look at the generation of people who mentored us. Those of us who thought of ourselves as young, we were young once, we're now pretty old, I gotta say. But those of us who had the good fortune to be mentored by Naseer and his generation, by Edward, by Samih, by Ibrahim, by the greats, the giants of that generation, who taught us about Palestine, who taught us how to organize, who taught us that you start where people are, that you don't start where you want them to be because then you lose them, who taught us how to organize. What a gift that we had that generation to learn from. And they created AAUG, they mentored young Arab Americans, but also a bunch of the rest of us who were not Arab Americans, who were Jewish or not Jewish or whatever, but who were, you know, we used to talk about others for Palestine. And it was this chance to learn from the greats of that generation. And now we have to learn to mentor the youngsters who are growing up in Students for Justice in Palestine, which now has chapters all across the country. The U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation that has over 400 member groups these days. Naseer was with us from the beginning of the campaign. He was on the advisory board of the U.S. campaign until he passed, until he left us. The Students for Justice in Palestine, the Jewish Voice for Peace, all of those organizations owe a debt to Naseer and to his generation that taught us what it was going to take. Because what they taught us, they were mostly academics. Yeah, actually, they were academic. But they also recognized that it wasn't going to be only academics who changed the world. And for those of us who were not academics, some of us who didn't graduate because we spent too much time organizing and, as a result, didn't finish a class or two that somebody realized was required, that we could still contribute something, you know, that it didn't take a PhD necessarily, that PhDs had a big job to do, but you didn't have to have a PhD to do this work. And it was because the understanding of the activism wasn't only about analysis, but it was based on rights. It was based on human rights. We saw that in Naseer's work. Naseer was not only a Palestinian activist. He was not only an activist for Palestinian rights. Naseer was one of the great internationalists of his generation. There was a reason that he worked in Amnesty International for so long. Yes, he fought with Amnesty and won a hard struggle to get Amnesty to take a position on Palestine that was a decent position. That was a huge struggle. But he also worked on the military dictatorships of Latin America because he was an internationalist, and he taught us that. He taught us to look at Palestine in the context of the world, not by itself. It was a struggle against colonialism when there were other anti-colonial struggles that also needed to be supported, and that we could look for allies in those other struggles. In the anti-apartheid movement that gave rise to the BDS movement of today, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement of today, that was rooted in the anti-apartheid movement around South Africa. And Naseer was one of those who taught us the importance of doing that, the importance of putting our work for Palestine in this much broader context. My own history with Naseer goes way back, but one part of it went on for 21 years in the LA 8 case. Looking around, I'm seeing that most people here are old enough to remember the LA 8 case. It took 21 years to win that case. And Naseer was going to be our star witness at the trial. He was our star witness on several hearings. He came back to LA over and over again. He came back, and the others came back. His generation were the experts that we could put on the stand to tell the history that the immigration judges needed to hear. And it was in that context of his political acumen, understanding the primacy of rights for Palestine and for the world, that he encouraged all the rest of us. He encouraged me to write a pamphlet for Terry that was sort of a background piece on what is Palestine? Who are the Palestinians? Why are they there? These basic kind of questions that people want answers to, and they're kind of embarrassed to ask. That has now morphed into a book that's now going into its 6th printing, has sold 35,000 copies around the country, around the world. So it was that understanding from Naseer about the importance of rights, the importance of education, the importance of reaching people where they are. This is what gave us the movement that we have today. It's a very different movement than the movement of the 70s when I started working on Palestine in the late 70s, when we stood in solidarity with the heroic people of Palestine, but we didn't understand what it was going to take to reach the American people in a way that did not compromise our values, but that spoke in a different language that people could understand. Naseer understood that. We didn't all accept it for a while, but eventually we did. So you have organizations that come together in something like the US campaign whose fundamental unity is that of human rights. Human rights for everybody, international law for everybody, equality for all. That's the basis on which Palestine will be free, not as an exception, but as part of the world. And it was, I think, recognizing that primacy of rights and fundamentally the primacy of the role of the United States and the need to challenge US policy as the first and last work of activists in this country, Palestinian activists, support activists, all of us who were fighting for justice, fighting for freedom, had to do that by challenging US policy. And we learned how to do that from Naseer. We have a new generation now that's rising up, and it's in Naseer's name. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. You have been a supporter of Palestine for many years, and we were very proud that you accepted to author that first publication of Terry about Palestine. I do remember that very well. Thank you again. Next speaker is a friend of the Palestine Center, friend of Naseer, and one of the most, probably one of the most silent activists in the cause of Palestine, Dr. Jamil Fayez. Dr. Fayez is a professor emeritus at Wake Forest University Medical School. He's another doctor in North Carolina and has a medical practice in Oakland, Virginia, but he's retired now and dedicates essentially all of his time to Palestinian activities. Dr. Fayez is a fellow of the American College of Obstetrician and Gynecologists and a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, which is the preeminent college for surgeons in the world. I say that personal privilege because I belong to that. That's whenever you see somebody with FACS beside their names, that's a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. But before Dr. Fayez come here, I just want to mention that several names were mentioned here, and I would like to add to them. The giants who in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and after 2000, who were identified in academia as Palestinian experts, Dr. Sharabi, Dr. Edward Said, Dr. Naseer Aruri, Dr. Ibrahim Abu Lughod, that Phyllis mentioned, were preceded also by another giant. That's Dr. Fayez Sail, who left us in 1980. And I'm always privileged and proud to say that my mentors started with Dr. Fayez when I was at the University of Utah. And later when I came to Washington, D.C. by Dr. Sharabi, Dr. Edward Said, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, who used to participate with us in the publication of Free Palestine, for those who would remember it, in the late 60s and 70s. And after that, Dr. Naseer Aruri. Dr. Fayez.
Thank you, Subhi, very much. If I say one word or two in Arabic, I will translate them into English. One morning, I received a personal email saying to me, your friend Dr. Aruri passed away. I immediately addressed my talk to Naseer in Arabic. And I said, Naseer, إن القلب لا يجزع وإن العين لا تدمع وإنا على فراقك يا نصير لمحزونون. Translated, the heart is shocked, the eyes are full of tears, and we are very sad for your departure. I immediately emailed back the person who emailed me. I said, I like to go to the funeral, period. Find out the way, what is the best way to go. A few hours later, he emailed me, impossible, and he explained to me, which is fine. Naseer, to me, was not a friend, was a brother. Anytime we have a chance to meet, we meet. Whenever he comes to a meeting in Washington, I go wherever he is there, Chicago or else, we sit together for 1 hour or so on a cup of coffee and we talk. One day, in year 2007, I sat with him on a cup of coffee and I said, Naseer, you will not believe what I'm going to tell you now. He said, what is it? You must be serious. I said, yes. I have a copy in my hand to prove to you that I am telling you the truth, because you will not believe it. This is from a friend of mine by the name of Franklin Lamb, who is international attorney. In the article, he says the CIA, American CIA, not Jamil, Fayez, or you or he. The CIA got a report saying that the downfall of Israel is inevitable within 20 years. Nothing will stop it. Nothing can prevent it, because it is going to be just exactly like the Soviet Union. The collapse is complete. And he explained why and how. And I said, here's the copy. He was a little surprised, but later he realized that it is a true report. The report went to some members, not all members, of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Please keep it personal, mentioned. And I said, Naseer, we as Palestinians, we should be in the front line of trying to facilitate the collapse and the end of this Zionist apartheid entity in Palestine. What should we do? He gave me this. What I admire with Naseer is after Oslo, many people I know personally surrendered for personal reason, nothing else. They changed their mind about Palestine. Sorry to say, they became traitors for the cause of Palestine. But Naseer never wavered at all. He always said there is one country only, called Palestine, and that country should be democratic and with equality for all its people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, anywhere they live. I said, Naseer, I need a favor from you. And I got a book here. I said, I made a book by the name of all the towns and villages destroyed in Palestine by the Zionists, by location, by size, everything on that little small town or a small village. What do you want to do to this? I'm going to do it soon. It was not yet published. He said he will make a blurb. And he made a blurb, and the blurb is at the end, the cover here, by Naseer Aruri, saying about what is this book about. So I made one edition, then another edition. I'm trying everywhere I go, everywhere I can. Proudly I say, at my own expense, that this book should be propagated everywhere. And I am making soon a third edition with different style, just to convince the American people that there was injustice in Palestine. And there was some problems in Palestine, and there will be no peace in Palestine as long as that Zionist entity occupies Palestine. We need peace based on equality, not on apartheid. And therefore, I gave the speakers, every one of them, a copy of this, and I have left with 3. But the new one, I will make sure I will spread it all over the country, and I know how to spread it all over the country because the American people started to change. Anybody who follows the American public knows exactly they are changing 100%, not 99. But the question is, you need people to talk to them. As a lady told me one time, I was in a church, and she raised her hand. She said, Dr. Fayez, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that the American public are fair-minded people. If you tell them the truth, they will be soldiers for the truth. It is your job to do the truth and tell it. And it is my duty to do it. We will do it to convince the American public that peace will come only through America, because they are the ones who do not know the story about Palestine. If you go to Europe, if you go to Asia, if you go to anywhere you want, most of the people believe that this is apartheid, this is colonialism, except America. America, because they are misinformed. Now they are getting informed, and we want them to be informed. I want to say something about Naseer. God bless you, Naseer. May God dwell you in heaven, and may God lead you to the right way, the way you were led in our day life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fayez. Dr. Edmund Gharib is back with us after he left for a minute. As I mentioned to you, he will be our next speaker. Dr. Gharib is one of the members of the Palestine Center Committee for many, many, many years, along with Dr. Halim Barakat, who is also in the audience. He's an internationally recognized expert on the Kurds in Iraq. He has taught at the American University in Washington, D.C. for 28 years, as well as Georgetown University, in DC and in Qatar, University of Virginia, and George Washington University. Dr. Gharib is an expert in the Middle East, and I know that he was a very close friend of Gharib and a co-author of what you have listened to many times referred to as the enemy of the sun. I do remember those days. Dr. Gharib.
Thank you, Subhi, and it's good to see so many friends of Naseer here, many of his colleagues, many of his friends, and people who knew him through his books and as well as his other activities. Professor Aruri, who's being remembered today by friends and colleagues, was a committed scholar and a progressive activist whose life touched many of us here today, and of course, many more beyond. His sharp intelligence, articulate vision, and the perspective he brought to the issues of Palestine, the Arab world, to U.S. foreign policy, justice and human rights worldwide, enriched and inspired numerous scholars and activists. I first came to know Naseer actually from what Jamil mentioned and what the film, he studied, we both studied at the same undergraduate school, which is American International College, and in Springfield, Massachusetts, although he was ahead of me, several years ahead of me. But I had one thing up on him. He worked for 75 cents. I was working at that time, and I got $1, and not 75 cents an hour. Naseer and I discovered through a mutual friend, actually, that we were both interested in Palestinian poetry, the new poets that were emerging in Palestine. And we were both interested. I had translated and published in some local papers and small student newspapers some of those poems, and he had done also the same thing. So we got together, we exchanged some of these works, and we both very much came back and talked about collaborating on producing an anthology, and the first anthology of Palestinian poetry to be published in the United States at that time. And so we put our heads together and we did a great deal of work. And of course, this was the book that ultimately was published, although it took a long, long time. We tried something like about 13, 14 different publishers before we were able to get the book published by an African-American press in Washington, D.C. One of the mutual friend of Naseer and I, who actually tried to help us to get the book published by Beacon Press, just recently heard about Naseer's passing, and he sent his condolences to Joyce, Jamil, and the whole family. And he told me something that was very, very interesting. That I didn't know before. He said that the U.S. poet laureate Richard Wilbur had read the poem "Lover from Palestine," which Naseer had translated. The way we work, by the way, is that each of us translated poems that he selected and liked, and then we would work together after that on the whole poem. But what Richard Wilbur said, that he was particularly, he very much particularly admired the translation of Darwish's poem, "Lover from Palestine." And this is really quite an honor in many ways, because he is a great poet. For me, the working with Naseer was really an education and a work of love. The first things that came across to me when I began working with him was his rigorous scholarship, his humility, and the depth of his knowledge. It was also a pleasure and a privilege to work with him later on, both in the AAUG later on, and then in the Jerusalem Fund and the Center for Policy Analysis on the Executive Committee. In all of these organizations that he worked on, he was a true leader, and he brought a vision to his work and to these institutions that he worked with. One thing that I think is very important to mention, and some of you may have already mentioned that, is that Naseer, one of his rare qualities is that he never varied his position on the important things. He always maintained his compass in the direction of Palestine. He was admired for his principles, for his intellect, and for his integrity. To me, he was a friend, a guide, and to many of us, he was a role model. Maybe sometimes because of the positions that he took, he angered or brought upon himself the wrath of some of the Palestinian leaders. But I think that did not affect or influence Naseer's position, because he believed in what he was doing, what he was writing about, and what he was saying, and he was committed to that. Before I conclude, I would like to read a couple of excerpts of two poems that Naseer translated. And this one, the first one, is by Fadwa Tuqan. And she talks about basically, it's titled A Letter to Two Children in the East Bank. And basically, she was explaining that the challenges that face Palestinians, Palestinian youth, and that they have a great responsibility for the future. And she had this to say: and then you will carry the weight. Play your part like us. Long is the book of struggle. Long is our story. My liberty, I shall carve its name while I resist on the land, by the walls and the doors, in the temple of the Virgin, in the altar, and the fields, on every hill and every valley and every curve and road, in prison, in the torture room, and on the gallows, despite the chains and the house demolitions. The second excerpt I'm going to read is from, again, Naseer translated it from Nizar Qabbani's Reflections on the Margin of Defeat, which was a poem that he very much liked and admired. He admired Qabbani a great deal. And as you know, most of you know that Qabbani was a poet of love, actually. But after 67, Qabbani began to write some political works, and this was one of them, and it was quite powerful. And he had this to say. He basically was talking about the commandos. He said, and after we were killed, and after we received the prayer of the dead, and were laid to rest, and after our bones decayed, and our skeletons crumbled, Fatah has emerged, and suddenly the coffins rebelled, and like Christ, rose from the dead. He continued basically to say that, he said, he also wrote in that poem, there were some references to the poets of Palestine. He said, poets of the occupied land, you are the prettiest bird to fly out of captivity. You are the roses growing from within the flame. You are the rain falling despite repression and defeat. You taught us how the drowned can sing. What can we tell you, friends, about the literature of the setback and its poetry? We have, since June, been laying on pillows, entertaining ourselves with grammatical rules suppressed but not opposed to repression. We mount wooden horses and fight the shadow of ghosts. One final thing I would like to mention, I just recently heard from a publisher that he is interested in reissuing the Enemy of the Sun. And I think this would be a good remembrance, a memorial, and a testimony to the works and life of Naseer Aruri. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Actually, the book that you published at that time, The Enemy of the Sun, inspired Dr. Hatem Hosseini and myself to take care of translating another book called Lover from Palestine, which you alluded to by Mahmoud Darwish, and it was published around that time for those who would like to check it out on Amazon or whatever. And just would like to mention a note that Naseer in 2001 was one of the founders, along with Phyllis, Bennis that you heard from, on the of the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation, which is now being led by a younger group of activists and Palestinians, and to whom our last executive director moved to. He's in the audience, I believe now Dr. Yusuf Munayir. After Yusuf moved to the U.S. campaign, we have a new executive director that we are very proud and privileged and delighted to have, and that is Zina Azam. Zina is now the executive director of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center. She has been in Washington around Georgetown University for many years. Many of you have worked with her. Before, she did work in the fields of education and Middle East affairs for, it says over 30 years, but I believe that must be a mistake. It must be 10 years or something. And anyhow, Zena served as the Director of Educational Outreach at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, another sister organization at Georgetown University. Zena?
Thank you, Dr. Ali. It's a privilege to be here today. We thought we'd have, in the spirit of poetry and more poetry by Palestinians, Palestinian great poets, we wanted to share a poem about the olive tree, which is such a profound symbol of Palestine and a real symbol of steadfastness. And we thought that Dr. Aruri would like that sentiment expressed today. It's a very short poem by Tawfiq Zayyad. On the trunk of an olive tree, I shall carve my story and the chapters of my tragedy. I shall carve my sighs on the grove and on the tombs of my dead. I shall carve the number of each deed of our usurped land, the location of my village and its boundaries, the demolished houses of its peoples, my uprooted trees. And to remember it all, I shall continue to carve all the chapters of my tragedy and all the stages of the disaster from the beginning to the end on the olive tree in the courtyard of the house. Thank you.
Thank you, Zina. The news of Naseer's passing actually came to me while I was traveling in an airport, I believe at Phoenix, Arizona or Las Vegas to Southern California to give a speech. And that was by a mutual friend, Dr. Mujib Kazemi. That was the first I heard about it, and within about 5 minutes I received another notification from Zena to the same effect, and that's just before I called Joyce and expressed my condolences. And with us from Massachusetts is Dr. Mujib Kazemi to say some words about Naseer. I believe he's one of Naseer's close friends. Dr. Kazemi is a well-known name. He is in the nuclear, he is currently working in the Nuclear Science and Engineering Department of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Obviously, he's a scientist and not a political academician. He is professor of nuclear engineering, professor of mechanical engineering, and director of some of the most important departments at MIT. I'm always intimidated when I read of Mujib's directorships. He has been a friend of the Jerusalem Fund for also many years, and a friend of Naseer. We're privileged to have you here, Dr. Kazmi.
It is so nice to be in the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. We need to keep up the activities related to Palestine and the advocacy of rights for the Palestinians, and these institutions will be the vehicle for reaching wider and wider audiences. Many of the speakers already mentioned that Naseer belongs to a generation of giants that was able to put together through personal convictions, strong convictions about the injustice in Palestine, and their sharp mind, the institutions and the information that influenced a wide variety of people and pushed the plight of the Palestinians to a higher level of awareness on the international stage than it would have been without them. And we owe them for that. Many of the names of villages that were mentioned, I visited because I went to Birzeit for high school. They had a high school at one time. And Burham and the other villages are within walking distance practically from Birzeit, and you heard that from Dr. Youssef. So you would know, you become familiar with topography. I always kidded Naseer that he says he's from Jerusalem while he really is from Burham. But he said, I always lived in Jerusalem and I only went occasionally to Burham. I'm proud of being born in Jerusalem, but I visited Burham as well. Many people talked about the intellect of Naseer and the activism of Naseer and how he was able to illustrate and demonstrate through his lectures, through his writings, through his appearances on TV, how the Palestinians in particular, but also the wider Arab masses, are often deprived of their rights. You know, he's best known for his work on Palestine, but in fact, as Phyllis said, he was a human rights activist, and he participated and not simply wrote about these rights in the defense of people through the organizations that he helped. And that's a distinction that Naseer holds in my mind. He is an institution builder. He is one of the people who knew that you can't simply rely on information provided in the past. You need institutions that continue to be engaged in the present and in different ways motivate people to become activists as well. AAUG was mentioned several times. In fact, that's where I first met Naseer. I came to the United States in '69 to go to graduate school, pursue my doctoral degree. And a friend told me about a gathering I came in September, and the gathering was in November at Northwestern University. And that was the second AAUG annual convention. So I went, and there was Naseer, very outspoken, very activist. I think we had a small demonstration against Ishaq Rabin, who was speaking at a nearby occasion just to counter the publicity that was given to AUG at the time. And I must have been impressed by him. I followed his steps in becoming an academician, although not in the field of political science. And I even to look for my wife in Springfield, Massachusetts. And luckily, I found one from there. I think Edmund remember the Denny's, yes. You know, the Aruris were always close to us, and we were close to them. I can second the impressions that you heard from Jamil about his father. When we went to have a dinner or a lunch or so on, the Aruris, it was usually, the food was cooked by Naseer, but then organized in a nice way by Joyce. And it was a common, a common production, always together. They were great with the family. And that's what's also something I learned from Naseer. You know, you can't go without having a devotion to the family and to the friends. And Naseer put family and friends just at the same level as he put human rights in terms of his attention. And he was always delighted to see his friends, and he was always delighted to be with his family. I owe him a great deal of inspiration. You know, he actually pulled me into AUG because when he became the president, the conference, the third conference of AUG was held in Boston, and he pulled a few of us together in order to man the conference and arrange for it. And of course, I stayed with it for many years, and like Naseer, became president of it twice, a distinction that only Naseer and I have held. When he established, or was one of the prime movers in the establishment of the Trans-Arab Research Institute, which exists now in Boston, we worked together on it, and again he pulled me on the board. He's an institution builder, and that's something that we should continue to do. We should be activists, but also build institutions to continue the work that he has done. And seeing all the friends who are around us today, and 200 or so people that I saw at the memorial at the University of Massachusetts last month, I'm confident that things will be continuously improving when it came to the rights of the Palestinians, when it came to justice in Palestine, but also the human rights movement around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kazmi. Next name on the list of speakers is Dr. Fayez Mughrabi. I don't see Fayez in the audience unless I've missed him. Oh. All right, Fayez. It's been many years since we met again. Yes. I've been looking around. But Dr. Mughrabi is now retired, and he is from the same state I've been in for the last 39 years, and that is the great state of Tennessee. Dr. Fayez was head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, and I'm glad that you could join us. Thank you.
It was in the context of our years of activism within the AAUG that I first came to know my good friend and colleague, Naseer Aruri. The AAUG was a unique moment in our history. It unleashed a remarkable wave of energy and creativity in defense of the rights of the Arabs, and especially the Palestinians, to become normal human beings with legitimate rights and aspirations. It brought together an incredible array of personalities who made a singular contribution to contemporary Arab American history. I am both honored and proud to have had a small part in all of this. I came to know and cherish so many. The indefatigable super organizer, Elaine Hagobian, a lady who can say the most radical thing and get away with it. And Abdeen Jbara, who loves life and lives it to the fullest. They were my first mentors. Ibrahim Abulod taught me more about Palestine than any professor throughout my years as an undergraduate and later a graduate student. I drank coffee with him every morning in our offices at the Qattan Foundation in Ramallah. I stayed up all night with him when he passed away and made sure to honor his wish to be buried next to his father and brother in the Muslim cemetery by the sea in Jaffa. Then there was Edward Said, Palestine's fine gift to the world, who would often take out his favorite Mont Blanc pen and say, "You don't mind, do you?" He would then scribble brilliant and greatly appreciated comments on my papers. His weekly calls gave me energy, made me laugh, and kept me in touch. There are many others, of course, who touched my life in so many ways. Of all of these, Naseer Aruri and Samih Farsoon hold a special place in my heart and in my memory. No blood ties united us. What we had came out of a common struggle, a deep kind of brotherly solidarity and friendship. What brought us together was the love of Palestine and an unselfish urge to right some historic wrongs. Like wicked schoolboys, Samih and I often indulged in making fun of and commenting on the absurd, comical behavior of some people around us, or at times some pompous people on a conference panel. Naseer would smile sheepishly, but rarely partook in our biting humor. He was always the quintessential gentleman, and I never heard him utter a critical remark or speak ill about anyone. In our unguarded moments, I often spoke to him in the village dialect that we had grown up with. He from Burham and me from Ain Karam. We both felt it was important to reconnect to the language of our peasant ancestors. Naseer Aruri, my good friend, who is Naseer's cousin, who teaches physics at Birzeit University, took me to see the house where Naseer's family lived in Burham. So I knew the real person beneath the polished, sophisticated, and urbane exterior of the man. He was as authentic as one could be, deeply rooted in the soil of Palestine and deeply committed to the restitution of Palestinian rights. His works emerge out of this commitment. He read everything, kept copious files, chronicled our history, and wrote an impeccable defense of our rights. He stood firmly on the left as a secular and progressive Democrat and never wavered or gave in to temptations of money, position, or status. When a democratic left is reconstituted in the Arab world, as it should and will be. After we bypass the current insanities, Naseer and his work will definitely have a place of honor. I recall our last conversation. We bemoan the sad state of affairs in the Arab world, and especially in Palestine. In our worst nightmares, we never thought things would be this bad. We were reassured, however, by two things. A new generation of bright, highly educated, and committed young Palestinian men and women is now in charge, and they are making an incredible contribution toward advancing the cause in new and creative ways. In the second place, despite the political paralysis of the current Palestinian leadership, I would even use stronger words to describe them, but let it be. Despite the political paralysis of the current Palestinian leadership, Palestine has nonetheless become a universal metaphor for the search for justice and equal rights. Naseer made his contribution to both of these and became one of those who inspired the burst of energy that became known as the Arab Spring. He passed away peacefully and without regrets in the loving arms of his family. I bow down my head to honor and salute a fallen comrade, and I solemnly promise that we will continue the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Fuad. We have two messages from colleagues of Naseer that could not be here and travel for different reasons. The first is a name that you have heard many times today, Dr. Elaine Hagobian, who is one of Naseer's closest friends and who actually worked with Dr. Farsoon, another name you've heard, and myself when we founded Terry. Dr. Elaine Hagobian is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Simmons College in Boston, and she taught actually at the American University in Beirut and was a distinguished lecturer at the American University in Cairo. She is the principal founder of Trans-Arab Research Institute, also known as TARI. She could not be with us today, but her words will be read by our Executive Director, Zena Azamagin. Zena?
Naseer Aruri by Elaine Hagopian, March 2015. 1967 devastated Arab Americans. Arab American intellectuals and professionals realized that they had shirked their responsibility to educate the public about the unjust conflicts in their homelands. These awakened and devastated individuals were primarily the highly educated immigrants to North America dating from the 1950s on, and they were joined by some American-born Arab Americans who shared their agony of conscience. Among the immigrants was our highly valued colleague in the struggle for justice, Naseer Aruri. Our vehicle for action was the Association of Arab American University Graduates, AAUG, formed in November 1967. No one embraced the burden of elevating the tortured body of Palestine and its people to public view more than Naseer. Here is the man I knew. He maintained a principled position on Palestine no matter the ups and downs of official Palestinian policies and political pressures. One state for Israelis and Palestinians with equal rights. He did not write public screeds or verbally whip his Arab American colleagues who embraced other options, but he never succumbed to their compromises. His criticism of such positions was always nuanced, never publicly angry. However, his public criticism of the outrageous Oslo Accords and Palestinian leadership was of a different order than disagreeing with colleagues. These were signed accords designed to dissolve once and for all any hopes of Palestinian sovereignty and legal rights. His 1995 book, obstruction of peace demonstrated authoritatively that the intent of Oslo was to repackage and expedite the old goal of destruction of Palestinian national rights. In this, he was joined by many, even some who had accepted the notion of two states. His 2003 book, Dishonest Broker, updated the obstruction of peace. These two, plus his 1983 edited book, Occupation, Israel over Palestine, among his many publications, offer the most comprehensive understanding of the Palestinian tragedy in the context of American, Israeli, and Arab politics. While others occupied the limelight, Naseer kept writing and speaking. He spoke and wrote with great clarity based on meticulous research. He made the issues of Palestine, the Arab region, and the strategic machinations of the U.S. and Israel accessible to thousands. He was a superb communicator and educator. As others came and went, hawking abysmal compromises constructed in conflict resolution seminars, Geneva hotels, and Oslo, Naseer never broke his stride on what he considered a just resolution for Palestinians and Israelis. After decades of Israeli occupation and the failure of so many false peace efforts, so many others across the world now echo Naseer's conclusion that the resolution of the conflict is to be found in one state with equal citizenship rights for all.
Thank you, Zina. The next message is from Dr. Sarah Roy, also another friend of the Jerusalem Fund and of course, of Naseer. She is a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Harvard University, specializing in the Palestinian economy, Palestinian Islamism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It will be read by Samira Al-Qasim, our project director. Samira?
This is called Remembering Naseer Aruri, A Brief Reflection. When I was pursuing my doctoral studies in international development, I knew that I wanted to do research in the Middle East, particularly around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I was unable to find a research topic that excited me, combining my disciplinary interest in development with my regional interest in the Middle East. So I turned my attention to Africa and fell in love with Tanzania. After much thought and planning, I set my research sights on the Maasai people. 1 year later, however, I found myself in a totally different place, interviewing people in the refugee camps of the Gaza Strip and in factories and labor organizations inside the West Bank. I was immersed in a reality that staggered me, helped by people I barely knew, whose assistance would have been inconceivable to me just a short time before. It was the mid-1980s, and at the time, I did not fully appreciate that I was entering a field of study and academic research that was politically volatile and extremely contentious, for which there was little support and even less understanding inside the academy and beyond. As a Jew and a child of Holocaust survivors, my work was beyond comprehension to many, if not most people, in my own community, including certain members of my extended family, a betrayal for which some have never forgiven me. When I think back over those 30 years, there were, of course, many difficulties and painful times, but most importantly, there were profound rewards and experiences that have been among the most meaningful of my life. Among those rewards are the truly remarkable human beings I came to know along the way. One cannot continue along such an arduous, albeit necessary path alone. It is simply not possible. Naseer was preeminent among those extraordinary individuals I encountered. I read his work years before I knew him, and his work showed me, as a young and inexperienced graduate student, that it is possible to challenge dominant ways of thinking and framing, that it is possible to shift, if not transform, intellectual boundaries and exercise much-needed criticism in a society actively positioned against such criticism. Naseer showed me that it is possible and crucial to make one's work public and accessible, and by doing so, resist the displacement of people's lived realities into simplistic, reduced constructs. He taught me that it is essential not only to see things as they are, but how they came to be, and to show that they are not inevitable but conditional, the product of human choices that can, and Naseer believed, will be changed. He embodied the role of the public intellectual and teacher in its truest sense, refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice, confronting extant orthodoxies rather than accepting them, and expanding the boundaries of legitimate debate. Naseer was among those few courageous scholars who, at an unwelcoming and indeed hostile time, painstakingly and with great determination, carved out the intellectual and political space that I, among myriad others, have entered and hopefully widened, legitimizing a discourse that the majority had long shunned and dismissed. Naseer was an individual and a scholar of immense integrity and dignity, always consistent on who he was and what he believed, and open to new ways of thinking and understanding. I cannot remember a time when I saw him get angry. He treated others with respect and consideration, including those with whom he disagreed. It is my great honor and privilege to have known and learned from him. I would not be who I am without his humane and luminous example.
Thank you, Samira. There are many requests by people in the audience to say words about Naseer, and I'm sure we can go on for the rest of the afternoon. But I hope that they all will forgive me for not veering away from the schedule. The last word, which will be before a lunch, be inviting everyone here for a lunch in honor of the Aruri family in our boardroom. The last word goes to Naseer's partner. Of all these years that you've heard about, she needs no introduction, Mrs. Joyce Aruri.
Thank you, Subhi, and thank you to your staff for all the work that they did to honor my husband. And I want to thank each of you for taking the time from your busy schedule today to honor my husband, Naseer Aruri. Before I start talking, I want to tell you something that I told my son Jamil today, the first time. I said to him, Jamil, you were 2 months old when the '67 war started. And you know, I look at you, Jamil, and I see that you've grown up. You've become a professional. You've raised 4 children. One of his children is now in college, Lila. And all this time, the Palestinians have been occupied. And somehow it gives a physical feeling for me when I look at Jamil and I see the years and years and years that they have had, that they've had to manage this. We're all sitting here, we're all in good condition in this country, and we live well. These people are under occupation, and it's heartbreaking to think how long it's been going on. More than half a century ago, I went to a dance sponsored by my church and met the person who would change, fill, and magnify the rest of my life. Naseer and I shared exactly 54 years of marriage. I kissed him goodbye on February 12th, 2015, the 54th anniversary of our wedding day. Our marriage was one of unconditional love, mutual respect, and unwavering support, though our backgrounds and personalities would have made us completely incompatible. Our life was rich in contradictions. Naseer was quiet and intellectual. I'm noisy, extroverted, and business-minded. Naseer had no knowledge of or interest in sports. I'm an avid fan. He used to say to me, Joyce, all over America, wives are asking their husbands, come sit with me and forget the football game. He said, I'm the only husband that's asking his wife to come and sit with me and leave the game. Naseer had no plumbing or carpentry skills. One day I asked him to tighten the screws on a toilet. What a mistake. Needless to say, you never take a hammer to a ceramic toilet, so of course that was it for the toilet. After that, if I needed help, I did the work myself or became very skilled at calling the professionals to do the repairs as soon as Naseer left the premises. Even more significant than our contrasting personalities, our religious traditions were different. You know, 54 years ago, what was it like for a Maronite Christian to marry a Muslim? The Muslims were much more tolerant than my family was, I can tell you that. But they grew to love Naseer. Even more significant than our contrasting personalities, our religious traditions were different, but Naseer's qualities, as all who knew him will attest, transcended differences. He was the living definition of a gentleman. My family always spoke of the way he uplifted and inspired them. My late brother Peter once said, "Naseer is the best thing that ever happened to our family." Sweet-tempered, modest, and kind, he was a person of fierce principles, but no viciousness. He possessed a nobility of spirit and purpose and a devotion to the cause of human rights that could neither be bought nor diverted. On June 4th, 1967, Naseer was awarded his PhD at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. His father had traveled to the U.S. for the first time to see his son secure his doctorate. It was a proud culmination of hopes, hard work, and sacrifice, made all the more precious by the presence of Naseer's father. Our joy spilled over. We had much to celebrate. Our son Jamil was 2 months old, and our daughter Lila took her first steps at a graduation party my parents had proudly presented for him. But our happiness was turned inside out the next morning when our son Faris turned on the television and announced, "Mommy, Mommy, there's a war in Palestine." With that sentence, our lives changed forever. The 6-day war shook Naseer to his core. From that point on, he dedicated himself to his people. He wrote, organized, and spoke with the passion of his great heart and the power of his superb intelligence to illuminate the Arab world to the west and to plead for justice for the Palestinians. Because of his ardent activism, he became an internationally recognized scholar on geopolitical affairs. I'd like to share with you a letter I received from a friend upon hearing of Naseer's passing. "Dear Joyce, I was saddened to hear about Naseer's passing. He's one of the greats. I still remember how he reacted when I called to tell him that some of the members of AAUG's 1987 youth delegation had been arrested and imprisoned by the Israeli soldiers. The delegates and other Western visitors had been demonstrating peacefully in front of the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem against the Israeli military harassment at their international work camp site the night before. After I gave him the names of the imprisoned AUG delegates, he asked me for the names of others who had been imprisoned with them. I was embarrassed that I hadn't even thought to inquire about them, but Naseer had. At that moment, I realized what should have been obvious to me, that Naseer's concern about injustice and human rights was universal and not limited to his own kind. Without intending to, Naseer had taught me a valuable lesson. I regret very much that I never told him that." That's the end of the letter. "My husband, the humble humanist, the incorruptible activist, the cherished man of both my dreams and my reality, has gone from us. He's left us with a priceless legacy that we will try to honor and a great void that we'll never fill. Thank you, Naseer, for the gift of yourself and for the light of your love and goodness that will continue to shine in our hearts, in our lives, and in the still dark corners of the world. Thank you."
Thank you, Joyce. And that was the last word. I would like to thank all of you for being here today. I would like to thank all the speakers who shared their memories with us. And I definitely would like to thank the staff of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center, who, as usual, have done a great job putting this program together. I think that we have done justice to the memory of Dr. Naseer Aruri, who have departed this world and will always be considered as one of the Palestinian giants.